Yeah. How's my sound? Okay. Good morning, everyone. We are on day 9 of the hearing in the supplemental requirements for water reuse rule. It's docketed by the Commission Administrator as WQCC 23-84. This is one of many public comment sessions. It's the first of 2 today. The next one will be at 1 p.m. So I have 4 names here for the 9 o'clock hour, and then I'll issue a general invitation in the event anyone hasn't had a chance to reach out to Pam to offer their name. Just a couple of things. I will ask you to spell your first and last name. My name is Felicia Orth. I might have forgotten to mention that. I will ask you to swear or affirm that you will tell the truth. I will ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Please collect your thoughts. I only invite public comment from each individual once. And if you have more to say than can be said in 3 minutes, please write it up and send it. Email is fine to Pam Jones. So the names I have are Paula Claycomb, David Snyder, Vicki Gottlieb, and Erlene Grossclose. I'll call them in that order. Paula Claycomb. Okay. Ms. Claycomb, can you hear me? Ms. Claycomb?
Yes, I'm sorry. I wasn't able to unmute and realized that I could do it.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. If you would
Okay.
spell your first and last name for the record, please.
Thank you. My first name is Paula, Paula. Last name Claycomb, Claycomb.
Thank you. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I am 71 years old and a 23-year resident in Taos. I want to thank you for providing different options for the public to comment on the proposed water reuse rule. I wish to cite an editorial by native New Mexican Paul Pino in the July 10th issue of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Quote, "Why on God's green earth would anyone think we want to irrigate with oil field waste that contains, on average, 195 picocuries per liter of radium? That is 3 times the level at which the Environmental Protection Agency characterizes a substance as radioactive waste," end quote. Do you really want our farmers and households to use water that is known to be dangerous to human, animal, and planet health? The proposed rule would also allow for produced water to be reused for industrial and demonstration projects off the oil field. It would increase the transportation and handling of produced water and thereby increase the likelihood of accidents and spills. And there are already an average of 4 toxic spills from oil and gas per day in New Mexico. When U.S. Senator Jim Inhofe died a few weeks ago, all the obituaries and remembrances that I read highlighted his denial of climate change and his fight against climate science. Is that how you want to be remembered? Offering the oil industry, which has rarely been held accountable for cleaning up the messes it leaves behind, a way to offload its radioactive, sickness-producing, and deadly waste for use on our beloved lands? Please, I respectfully request that you return to the 2022 report by the New Mexico Water Task Force. It includes many recommendations which the state has not implemented or fully funded. I do not want my 11-year-old granddaughter or any of your children or grandchildren to live in a Mad Max world. Accepting the rule as proposed would contribute to that horrible scenario. I urge the committee to support a rewritten rule that clearly prohibits the discharge, disposal, or reuse of produced water off the oil fields. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Claycomb. David Snyder.
Yes.
Hello, would you spell your first and last name for the transcript?
Davidsnyder.
Thank you. And do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start your 3 minutes.
Thank you. My name is David Snyder. I grew up in Albuquerque and my daughters were born there. And I have many family members of several generations who live in New Mexico, many of them native New Mexicans. I clerked for New Mexico Supreme Court Justice Richard Bosson in 2008 and 2009. I now live in California, where I'm a lawyer and I lead a nonprofit organization that advocates for government transparency and First Amendment rights. My testimony is only on my own behalf, not that of my organization. Transparency is the lifeblood of any democracy worthy of the name. That means transparency in how the government itself operates and how private industry operates when its work is regulated by government. There's far too little transparency surrounding PFAS and other contaminants involved in fracking. There should be public hearings on this issue, and the commission should require the industry to disclose what it knows about these contaminants before any rulemaking. Far too much is at stake to take industry's word for it. The people of New Mexico, including generations of future New Mexicans, deserve more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Vicki Gottlieb.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Hello. Would you spell your first and last name for the transcript, please?
Vicki, V-I-C-K-I, Gottlieb, G-O-T-T-L-I-E as in every, B as in boy.
Thank you. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 3 minutes.
When we moved to El Rito, New Mexico in 1970, we occasionally went to Los Alamos to buy the lab's used and leftover project items, which were all sold by weight. I recall hearing then that the incidence of cancer there was statistically high due to the use and handling of radioactive material. When my husband had the choice of relocating to Grants or Roswell as medical director of a small Loveless primary care group practice, I influenced his choice to be Roswell. I was pregnant with our second child, and to protect my growing family's health, I knew I didn't want to live near where uranium was or had been mined. I recognized that regardless of our financial resources, about $2,500 annually in the early 70s to a single salary in Roswell in the early 80s that equaled our combined salaries in DC. We had the privilege of choosing where to live. Many New Mexico citizens do not enjoy that privilege. I believe we can learn from our mistakes. Regulatory responses are key, and wastewater reuse rule WQCC 23-84, as drafted, lacks the important health protections all citizens require. Please include the following. No person shall discharge, dispose of, or reuse treated or untreated produced water off of the oil field. The department shall deny certification of any federal permit proposing to discharge, dispose of, or reuse treated or untreated produced water off of the oil field. to avoid further degradation of the environment and ensure the public's health, safety, and welfare. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gottlieb. Erlene Grossclose. Okay, and I don't see her in the room. All right. Michael Sauber.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Would you spell your first and last name for the record, please?
Michael Sauber, Michael Sauber.
Thank you. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
All right. I'll start your 3 minutes now.
Okay, thank you. As one of 2 million taxpayers paying everyone's salary there for the purpose of protecting us from harmful pollutants and protecting our water supplies, I'm pretty upset. First of all, I'm upset because you're using the industry language of produced water instead of really calling it what it is, toxic fracking fluids. Their waste should never leave the oil field, and it's your job to ensure that. I'm upset because no credible scientific evidence exists that toxic fracking fluids can be cleaned to any health standard, especially at scale, when considering it contains uranium, plutonium, arsenic, lead, benzene, toluene, xylene, PFAS compounds, to name just a few. It's not like we don't have enough of our neighbors suffering the effects of cancers and immune system disorders that we need to create new ways to kill us or reduce health and life expectancy. It should be up to the industry to produce peer-reviewed scientific evidence that it's safe and at the scale they are proposing, and it's your job to your responsibility to ensure that before any decisions are made. I'm upset that the state has never enough personnel to monitor and increase and ensure the safety of fracking wastewater. Spills have increased in the last year. And if we don't have the personnel to sufficiently monitor something so critical that affects citizens' health, should we really be allowing it? I hope you would agree. I'm upset because the law clearly states that use of any fracking water shall obtain a permit from the Department of Environment. And a permit is necessary, and it's right to require one. I'm upset that you're considering spending taxpayer money on something that should be a cost of doing business. I've run 2 businesses in my 46 years in New Mexico, and I've never been the recipient of any taxpayer-funded bailout of something that should be a cost of doing business for the oil and gas industry. It needs to either stop fracking or find an acceptable way to deal with their toxic fracking waste on their own oil fields. As regulators who ensure the safety of our health, I want each and every one of you to state clearly that if this passes, you and your children will be the first to drink a tall glass of this healthy treated water before any is used in any shape or fashion on land outside of the oil and gas industry land. Thank you very much. It's appreciated.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on the platform who would like to offer and who has not already offered a comment, would like to offer a comment during this session? There will be another session at 1 p.m. today. Please put something in the chat. I'd like to comment. Okay, let me ask if there's anyone in the room who's here to offer comment during this session. No? All right, then we're going to return to the technical case. And again, there will be another public comment session at 1 p.m. So, Ms. Fox. We have just a little administrative matter to.
Is this working? Yes,
It is.
Pardon me? It's good. It's just a minute 18. Good morning, commissioners. I'd like to move to admit ABSC Exhibit 18 Rev which I passed out this morning to the commission and served on council last evening and put in the Dropbox. And Commissioner Brancard has asked that that exhibit be supplemented with another page from the Excel spreadsheet that is referenced in Mr. Jacoby's testimony on page 7, line 134. It is data underlying NMED exhibit 140, and I move to admit.
I'll pause in the event there are objections.
We understand that the entire thing is in the record. So, and we understand this then to be a demonstrative exhibit, and on that basis have no objection.
Okay. Anything else? All right, it's ABSC 18 Rev is admitted.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Mr. Wexler and Mr. Jacoby at the presentation table, and we need Ms. Nanasi in the cross-examiner's seat.
As we're setting up, just to, yesterday there was some discussion about our order. I just want to make clear our order for everyone so there's no confusion going forward.
Great.
After Mr. Jacoby, Mr. McCurdy, who's here in the hearing room, will testify. After that, it will be Mr. Balch, who is testifying remotely. He's in Pittsburgh. His only limitation is he has to be off the stand by Friday at 11. After Mr.
I'm sorry, but is your microphone on?
I think so.
It is? Could you just say, I'm so sorry, I didn't hear. Right after Mr. Jacoby, who goes next?
So after Mr. McCurdy is, after Mr. Jacoby is Mr. McCurdy. He'll be here live. Mr. Balch will then testify remotely. After Mr. Balch, we have Mr. Tischler, who is from Austin and is here in person. So we're hoping to have him on and off by the end of the week, by Friday. And then finally will be Mr. D'Antonio, who does have limitations on Friday. So we'll see how long it goes on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Oh, Commissioner Brancard, are you?
It's making it confusing to me to figure out just what NMOGA's position is in this matter, because we're not hearing from your primary witnesses.
Understood. So let me be clear about the reason for doing that, Commissioner Brancard, and apologize for any of the inconvenience. It has to do with the schedule of witnesses and travel and that sort of thing. So to be clear about NMOGA's position in this case, we support reuse. We support the development eventually of standards. We think that the technology exists to meet just about any standard that exists or could be adopted. I think the primary difference that we have with the Environment Department is we support the December version of the rules as originally proposed. We do not support, and we don't think it's either legally or factually supported, the idea that there would be a prohibition on all discharges of treated produced water. We think that the existing standards and the process for discharge permits is sufficiently protective as standards are developed, because it gives the flexibility to the department to develop the record, understand what's being discharged, what the plan for discharge is, ensure that all the standards will be met. If there are additional concerns for the Environment Department, they can, of course, add conditions, and then there's monitoring. So we think that that whole process is safe, protective of human health and the environment. And while the commission is waiting for new standards to be proposed, either by the department or some other entity, we think that discharge permits ought to be permitted.
Madam Chair, now I'm really confused.
Okay.
Because Mr. D'Antonio's direct testimony stated one position on this rulemaking, and then his rebuttal testimony stated a new position, and now we seem to be going back to his original position?
I don't think that's, so let me try and
Excuse me,
reconcile.
Madam Hearing Officer.
Yeah.
I think this is inappropriate. This is a lawyer testifying at this point.
Okay, thank you.
I
Mr.
object.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brankard, let me ask Mr. Wexler a question here.
Certainly.
My memory is that Namoga has not yet made its opening statement.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps, Mr. Brankard, we could wait for that. And
Okay,
I think
it seemed like an opening statement here, but.
Well, you were just asking me to.
you
explain-
invited
Yeah.
that. I'm just saying, let's get through Mr. Jacoby.
So we're gonna have all the witnesses before they give their opening statement?
Well, our hope is to put the witnesses on today because we have time considerations. And then we're happy to fill in the gap with our position statement. I was simply trying to reconcile. I don't think it's obviously not evidence. It's simply
It's a statement, I understand.
correct.
I would still like to hear the opening statement, though.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
And when do you want us to put that on?
Well, how about we get through Mr. Jacoby and then do it?
Happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. A lot of this, Mr. Bankert, is just driven by the scheduling constraints of NEE's witnesses, the scheduling constraints of NMOGA's witnesses. There's just been a lot of accommodation.
I do have one request on can we put Mr. McCurdy on first and do the opening after lunch, only because we just changed law firms. Right now, I'm unable to access my system, and I will be positive I can have that system after lunch. So
Okay, all right.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go back to Mr. Jacoby's questioning. Ms. Nanasi.
Thank you so much.
Can you hear me this morning? I understand yesterday the reporter was a little put out with me by the end of the day. I apologize.
Ms. Nanasi.
Good morning. Ms. Jones, may I ask you if you could please pull up New Energy Economy Exhibit 23 again? Thank you. And it's PDF page 5 that I'm looking at. Mr. Jacoby, I just have a couple of questions about this when this gets pulled up. Yes, please, PDF. Right there, to that picture. Actually, no, I'm wrong. That doesn't seem like the picture that I want. I think it's the next page. Yeah, thank you. So if you look at the picture on the right, it has a radioactive symbol on a yellow background that's on that container. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Have you ever been to this West Texas site?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What was it?
Have you ever been to this West Texas site that's maintained by Lotus LLC?
I have.
And did you see containers like the one that is depicted in the picture here and the one that we saw yesterday?
Occasionally I do.
Madam Hearing Examiner, once again, I'd like to move the admission of New Energy Economy 23.
I'll pause for objections.
We object on relevance grounds. I'm not sure whether or not Mr. Jacoby has been to this site and seen this yellow mark has any tendency to prove or disprove a fact that's at issue in this case.
He just said that he was at the site.
I'm
And he
sorry?
saw, Mr. Jacoby just testified that he has been to the site and has seen containers that look like this there.
Okay, and the relevance to this rulemaking then?
Well, I believe that Mr. Jacoby is a lobbyist, has been a lobbyist, and is a consultant currently for Lotus LLC. He has talked about basically in his testimony that Mr. Noble's allegations, as he calls them, are fraught with misrepresentations, and I believe that the standard is relevance. This is clearly relevant about kind of work that Mr. Jacoby does, and I think the commission will find it useful if they decide to look further into this article. And Mr. Noble presented this as part of his testimony and exhibits.
Oh, Mr. Noble spoke to this?
He did refer to this body of work, including in his book, which I can hold off because I will go into that further in my cross-examination.
All right, why don't you do that?
Okay. Could we go to your rebuttal, please, sir?
Respond to one thing you just said. I was a lobbyist. I am a lobbyist, but I did not lobby for Lotus in the 2023 session, and I'm not currently retained by them as a lobbyist.
Could you please go to your rebuttal, sir?
May take me a minute to find all this. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Okay, so if you go to page 15, I think we addressed your Mr. Noble's allegation number 1, and now I'm going to go through the rest of them. Could you go to Noble's allegation number 2, and particularly, I'm wanting you to read, if you would, the sentence that begins on line 2299.
He anecdotally describes a fire in a facility located in West Virginia that was damaged by fire in May 2023 and where produced water was processed previously.
Thank you. May I approach, Madam Hearing Officer? I've now tendered to you previously marked Exhibit 11, and this is regarding this is the EPA bulletin concerning the Fairmont Brine site in West Virginia from September 22nd, 2023, correct?
That's correct.
And sir, could you please read the commission under 1.1.2.2 description of threat? Could you please read that?
Before we read it, may I ask, has this already been admitted?
Yes, it has. Okay.
Very well, thank you.
May I ask, whose Exhibit 11 are you talking about?
This is we handed it out when Mr. Noble was testifying, the highlighted version of Exhibit 11, which is part of his testimony that was also admitted into the record. I wait.
Give us just a second.
Yeah, please.
but every party is using numerical numbers. So who's exhibit 11? Are we talking?
NEE. NEE.
NEE. Okay,
This
thank you.
actually Justin Noble's exhibit 11, which was attached to his rebuttal testimony. However, we also, when he testified, gave out a copy that was highlighted to all the commissioners 2 days ago. Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd like to repeat my question if I can. Could you please read under 1.1.2.2 the description of the threat from this EPA bulletin?
Uncontrolled release of CERCLA hazardous substances, primarily the release of radionuclide radium-226 from a former brine processing plant.
And could you turn to the next page, please? And read where I've highlighted the first two highlights under paragraph G and H.
G reads, as described in A above, a tank in the upper complex caught fire on 5/30/23 and the contents exploded, launching the tank top over a building and landing approximately 100 yards from its original location. H reads, readings collected around the tank using field radiation survey equipment indicated levels of gamma radiation of approximately 1 MR per hour at the time of the fire. The data collected indicated the radionuclide released was radium-226. Radionuclides, including radium-226, are hazardous substances listed in 40 CFR 302.4.
So your claim that this was just a mere anecdote by Mr. Noble, wouldn't you say that that's a misrepresentation?
Not at all. My complaint about how Mr. Noble wrote about this is he compared it to Chernobyl, a reactor in Ukraine that blew up and spewed radiation all over Europe. That's not this facility. Now, granted, this was a mess and it needed to be cleaned up, but it was not Chernobyl. He overstated it, helped him sell his book, I presume, but that's simply not true.
And other than your complaint that it was overstated by Chernobyl, you're not saying that the radiation and the fire and the fact that this is cordoned off now, this whole site, you're not saying that that is meaningless for this commission to understand when this was about a produced water recycling facility, right?
No, I would take this very seriously. This is a mess. But this is not indicative of what goes on in New Mexico or Texas. This is a facility in West Virginia.
Here, later on that same page, at the bottom of 15, you make that kind of relationship, which is like, while we have no evidence of New Mexico produced water treatment facilities failing, you would agree that we must take care to prevent such an occurrence from happening here, right? Like what happened in West Virginia.
Well, of course, and that is the second thing I think should be noted this facility is regulated by the regulators, radiation control regulators in West Virginia. And it should never have been allowed to get into this condition to begin with. I've worked with the New Mexico Radiation Control Bureau, and I can tell you they're among the strictest in the nation. I don't believe this would happen in New Mexico.
Let's go to allegation number 3. And that is this is about the Aqua Salina, where they used that contained radiation, where it was on the shelves of Lowe's and Hartville Hardware. Again, you acknowledge that this is not a mere allegation, right? This actually happened.
Let me refresh my memory on this. Oh, this is the Ohio use of produced water for treating ice on roadways. I'm a Texan, so I don't really know much about ice on roadways, but
they found
yeah.
that to be radioactive, right?
Pardon me.
They found that to be radioactive, correct?
It did contain some radioactivity.
Yeah. Not just some, it was something like 1,000, more than 1,000.
It contains some radioactivity.
Okay. And in fact, the department, the state of Ohio since banned that Aqua Salina.
The Ohio Bureau of Radiation Control did their own analysis and determined that it contained that the using ResRad, which is a computer model to predict dose to the public, that the dose was about 0.4 millirem per year, I presume. Yeah, 0.441 millirem per year, which is well within acceptable levels. My impression is there was some further political and other concerns coming from other areas, and the Radiation Control Bureau said, we're going to shut this down until we resolve it.
I assume you are concerned about the health and welfare of the workers who handled and stocked that de-icer Aqua Salina, correct?
The workers that handled it did what? I'm sorry.
The workers that handled that Aqua Salina, you're concerned about that, correct?
Well, if it's sold as a commercial product and there's no dose exceeding the allowed dose to the public, I don't think you need exceptional radiation control.
Could you please go to Justin Noble's exhibit number 12, which is New Energy Economy exhibit number 5, I believe. Could you go to that peer-reviewed article? It's Justin Noble 12.
12, the Burgos paper.
Yes.
Okay.
So the title of this peer-reviewed article that appeared in Environmental Science and Technology from 2018 is called Environmental and Human Health Impacts of Spreading Oil and Gas Wastewater on Roads. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you read the abstract for us, please? And please speak closely to the microphone.
You want the entirety of the abstract?
Yes, please.
So the abstract says 13 states in the United States allow the spreading of oil and gas wastewaters on roads for de-icing or dust suppression. In this study, the potential environmental and human health hazards of this practice are evaluated. Analyses of oil and gas wastewater spread on roads in the northeastern U.S. show that these wastewaters have salt, radioactivity, and organic contaminant concentrations, often many times above drinking water standards. Bioassays also indicated that these wastewaters contain organic micropollutants that affected signaling pathways consistent with, consistent with xenobiotic metabolism and caused toxicity to aquatic organisms like Daphnia magna. The potential toxicity of these wastewaters is a concern as lab experiments demonstrated that nearly all the metals from these wastewaters leach from roads after rain events, likely reaching ground and surface water. Release of a known carcinogen, e.g. radium, from roads treated with oil and gas waters has been largely ignored. In Pennsylvania from 2008 to 2014, spreading oil and gas wastewater on roads released over 4 times more radium to the environment, 320 millicuries, than oil and gas wastewater treatment facilities, and 200 times more radium than spill events. Currently, state-by-state regulations do not require radium analyses prior to treating roads with oil and gas wastewaters. Methods for reducing potential impacts of spreading oil and gas wastewaters on roads are discussed.
And sir, you're familiar with this study, correct?
Yes.
And it was largely cut as a result of a number of the universities in Pennsylvania that collaborated on this. Is that correct? You see here at Pennsylvania State University, a couple of people from that institution, and then also actually from Canada, different scientists from there participated in this. Is that right?
That's correct.
You know that subsequent to this study, that not only Pennsylvania, but 3 other states banned de-icing and dust suppression using treated produced water.
Yes.
So if we could now go back to your testimony and go to allegation number 4. This is referencing Mr. Noble's testimony and the linkage here between radium and carcinogenic material. That's what you're talking about here, right?
Yes, this is, I believe, his allegation that ingestion caused childhood cancer, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Okay.
And so you're a radiation specialist, wouldn't you say?
I am.
Okay. And you're familiar, in fact, with EPA's facts about radium, correct?
I am.
And so, according to the EPA, quote, if inhaled as dust or ingested as a contaminant risk, there's an increased risk for several diseases, including lymphoma, bone cancer, and hematopoietic, which is blood formation diseases. And I'll spell that for the record, HEMATOPOIETIC, such as leukemia and aplastic anemia. Would you say that your understanding of contamination by radiation and its effects on human health is consistent with the EPA facts about radiation?
I don't know the specificity as you read it, but I do know that radiation could be a cause for cancer.
It goes on to say that quote, risks of cancer is increased in essentially all tissues and organs. Is that your understanding as well?
That is a possibility.
So let's go to allegation number 5.
But before we go to 5, I think
know what?
it's important to know he was
Excuse me?
talking about Ewing's sarcoma.
Okay.
And the
Excuse
medical
me?
doctors,
Oh,
not
madam,
me,
Hold
medical
on.
doctors believe that's not correct.
All right, hold on. We have to speak one at a time in order for the court reporter and interpreter to catch our words. Ms. Zanasi, I think you should let him finish what he started. Mr. Jacoby, please finish what you were starting there.
Thank you. My concern about allegation number 4 is that Mr. Noble focused on Ewing sarcoma, which is a cancer in children. I presume I'm not a medical doctor, but the American Cancer Society and several other medical journals reported that there is no known connection between radiation exposure and Ewing sarcoma. That was my concern.
Thank you. If you go to your Nobel's allegation number 5, here you criticize Noble for relying mostly on his book and his interviews with workers. Is that essentially what this allegation number 5 is about?
Yes, let me review it quickly, if you don't mind. My concern about this number 5 is that he had these anecdotal conversations with workers and others about detriments that they had from their employment. He, however, did not bounce that, I believe, by checking with the company's environmental health and safety officers or other medical doctors that could have given a more balanced viewpoint.
Madam Hearing Officer, may I approach?
Yes.
This page.
Okay.
So I have just tendered you the book that Justin Noble just published in April of this year. Could you read the title of that book?
The title of the book is Petroleum 238.
Okay, could you read who the book is dedicated to? Just the first bold section up there.
It says, there are a number of people whose words and stories are included in this book and informed my reporting, yet passed away before the work could be completed. This book is dedicated to them.
And sir, could you go to where yes, right where your hand is, right there. Starting on page 351, is it correct, if you just look briefly, that his book cites almost 75 pages of citations? And if you look at page 423, you started on page 351. If you go to page 423, there are a total of how many sites there?
336 sites.
And could you read the blurb about Mr. Noble on the right-hand flap of that book jacket?
Justin Noble writes on science and environment for U.S. magazines, investigative sites, and literary journals. His work has been published in Best American Science and Nature Writing and Best American Travel Writing, a book he co-wrote with a death row exoneree. The story of Dan Bright was published in 2016 by University of New Orleans Press. his 2020 Rolling Stone magazine story, America's Radioactive Secret, won an award for the long form writing with National Association of Science Writers and inspired this book. Justin's writing has helped lead to lawsuits, academic research, public dialogue, and has been taught with Harvard School of Public Health.
Before we go on to your allegation number 6, could you tell?
Are you done with this?
Yeah, thank you. Before we go on to allegation number 6, could you tell us how much you're being paid for your testimony in this case?
$400 an hour for testifying.
On allegation number 6, this is about your critique of Mr. Noble for including information about the fact that New Mexico, no, strike that. In allegation number 6, you're not denying that New Mexico still continues to suffer from the uranium mining and milling injuries that have happened here nearly 50 years ago.
I think that's stated poorly. I wouldn't use the word suffered. I think there are still some sites that need to be cleaned up. To the extent anybody suffers from them, I just don't know. I suspect that's not entirely true.
Do you know that the Church Rock uranium mill spill was the largest release of radioactive material in U.S. history, having released more radioactivity than the 3 Mile Island accident 4 months earlier, and that happened on Navajo Nation tribal land, tribal trust land.
I know of the incident. I think trying to compare it to 3 Mile Island might be misleading because the isotopes are different. The release is different. There's a lot of differences. I'm not downplaying the release. It's unfortunate that it happened.
You should definitely take that up with Wikipedia. Let me ask you this. Do you know that the breach released more than 1,100 short tons of solid radioactive mill waste and 94 million US gallons of acidic radioactive tailings into the Rio Puerco?
I read that in Mr. Noble's book, but I haven't validated it.
And again, have you ever been to Church Rock where it happened?
Pardon me?
Have you ever been to Church Rock?
I have not. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't been there.
There's an annual march to commemorate that site, and that site is still there, right? It hasn't been cleaned up.
It's been stabilized, but it's not been entirely removed.
Not even not entirely, but not removed at all, correct?
Not removed at all, but it is stabilized.
Again, this history is instructive for us to learn from and take caution. You're not asking this commission to ignore both the incidents in the past 50 years ago and radioactive spills and contamination, or the West Virginia incident in 2023. You're not asking the commission to ignore that, right?
I wouldn't ask the commission to ignore that, but I would ask the commission to realize that was 50 years ago, and the industry does a lot of things differently now to make sure those things don't ever happen again.
But this happened in 2023 in West Virginia. You've already testified to that.
The incident that occurred in West Virginia occurred because, in my opinion, the regulators should have done a better job of overseeing that facility. I don't think that would happen in New Mexico.
Because the regulators did a good job, right?
They do a very good job in this state. They're among the most difficult to deal with in the United States, believe me.
Now, if you go to,
Hold on. Yes. Yes. We have to take care of an interpreter issue.
Amelia, we aren't able to hear you anymore in the Spanish channel. No, we're still not able to hear you. We can hear you now. Thank you. Apologies.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Ms. Nasi.
Thank you. If we go now to allegation number 7, you sort of, you dispute his testimony regarding salt water disposal wells, but again, you don't have any citation or justification here, right? It's just, you don't agree with what he said, and that's it.
Um, I don't think I agree with what he said, but I don't think that's really an issue in this proceedings. I just didn't spend much time on it, to be frank with you.
Okay. So your allegation number 8, you say here on line 415, you're concerned about you restate Mr. Noble's concerned about radioactive contamination, and then you say he creates, quote, a concerning and liability stoked legal landscape due to contamination. Due to aforementioned widespread contamination. Is that right? That's what you say here?
A liability stoked legal landscape due to aforementioned widespread contamination, yes.
If contamination occurs in New Mexico, do you not anticipate there would be litigation?
No, I'm certain there would be. There always is.
Isn't Mr. Noble's message to avoid such harms by enacting precautionary safety regulations for oil workers before damage happens?
Objection, I'm not sure Mr. Jacoby can say what Mr. Noble intended with his testimony.
Would you rephrase that question?
I believe it's completely relevant. Mr. Jacoby, were you here when, may I ask another?
Just rephrase the
okay.
question, that's all.
And Mr. Jacoby, you were here when Mr. Noble testified, right?
I was.
And you heard him repeatedly say that he was really concerned that these regulations don't protect worker safety, correct?
I did hear him say that.
And you also heard him say that it was incumbent upon this commission to enact regulations that would take into consideration both norm, that the fact that it exists, and also that the workers who work in produced water, having anything to do with produced water, might be radioactively poisoned. Is that also true?
Can you say that again, because I get a little lost there? Are you suggesting that, well, I don't want to ask what you're suggesting. What point were you making?
Mr. Noble was asking this commission to enact regulations that recognize the existence of norm in produced water, correct?
Yes.
And he was also asking this commission to only pass regulations that would protect worker safety in the event that there was any reusable, any reuse of produced water. Is that also correct?
I believe that's what he said, yes.
Nothing further.
All right, thank you. Ms. Nasi. Mr. Wexler, do you have any redirect?
Just a couple of questions. Good morning, Mr. Jacoby. Commissioner Patton yesterday asked you about the possibility of radium accumulating in the soil after application to land for agricultural purposes. You recall that?
Yes.
And in your response, you discussed the 515 rule, but really about when a well is decommissioned. Would the same process apply to agricultural lands?
Yes, it does.
And can you describe that process, please?
So here's what is commonly done. If you have radium on the surface of the land that exceeds the 5 picocuries per gram limit, you would go out, with a radiation detector of some sort, survey the area, find those areas that happen to be exceed the regulatory limit, stake them, mark them in some way, go back and do further surveys to understand the extent of the contamination, where it is and what it is. You would then go out and you do a grid and it's normally a 100 square meter grid. It's 10 meters by 10 meters on a side. Mark it off, and then you would take a number of samples appropriate to evaluate what the radiation level is in that area. And normally it's what they call a 5-spot. You would take one sample at each corner of the grid and one in the middle, send that to a laboratory, get a accurate measurement of the radioactivity. If it's above the limit, you would take some action to decontaminate that area, if you will. Normally, you do that simply by disc plowing the area, because if it's not extremely contaminated, if you plow the area so that you churn the radioactivity and mix it in a soil, it will usually be below release limits. If it's not below release limits, when you do that, you have to excavate it and send that to a disposal site. And that's what's done. When you get through, the land meets the criteria for clean soil.
This morning, Mr. Jacoby, you were asked about some 3 or 4 examples of other spills or untreated produced water for purposes such as de-icing. To be clear, is it your testimony that produced water can be treated to appropriate standards for radiation?
Yes.
And if treated to standards, the treated produced water is safe for the human health and the environment?
Yes.
No further questions.
Okay, any reason not to excuse Mr. Jacoby? Right, thank you very much, Mr. Jacoby, for your testimony.
We'll call Mr. McCurdy to the stand, and Ms. Olson will be presenting him.
All right, thank you. Should we take 5 minutes?
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, just 5 minutes to change witnesses. Let's come back from the break, please. All right, we are back after a very short break to have a new counsel and new witness at the presentation table. See here, I think this is Mr. McCurdy. Would you spell your first and last name for the transcript, please? Thank you, and do you swear or affirm to tell the truth? Thank you very much. Oh, you're gonna have to have the mic.
Okay,
Ooh,
now it's on.
reasonably close, but not too close.
Let's try to find a good balance here.
All right.
Would you need me to repeat that? It's
Yeah,
nice.
it's fine. Ms. Taylor.
Order is.
Yes, oh, for cross, it's the same as we always do.
Okay.
Mr. Maxwell, you, Mr. Cox, Mr. Hightower, Mr. Davis, Ms. Nanasi, Ms. Fox, Mr. Knight.
Okay. Yeah,
Oh,
I just put it in. I just put it into presentation mode. Okay. On our screen.
It's in presentation mode on your computer, yes.
It's in presentation on our computer. Doesn't look like it's showing up in presentation on there. So do you think that might be like a lag or?
Try going to the next screen on. No.
Sometimes hitting the plus sign helps.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah,
This is very.
I don't see a.
up at the top, there's a plus sign.
Oh.
Sometimes hitting that makes things bigger.
It's just in the.
we're currently in presentation mode on this laptop, but it's not showing up there in presentation.
Should be mirror. Sharing. So do share again. Oh, wait, that's not what. Share on. Then you want to.
Sorry, hit the word slideshow. I think that might help. It's up at the top.
And you can get out of this.
Oh, from beginning.
Madam Hearing Officer, we can see the presentation on the platform.
Thank you very much, Commissioner McWilliams. Did you hit from beginning?
Yes,
Okay.
it's on
Okay.
the beginning and then our.
It's-
It's not SMG and on the.
So I think this.
Well, I'm advancing this.
I see.
We're just
Oh. I was just going to say, instead of advancing, sometimes you can just hit the slides along the left-hand margin.
the presentation is showing screen showing as it's not showing the same on the screen.
Okay,
I'm not sure why.
okay.
I'm gonna try doing entire screen. That doesn't seem to be. You may have to just control your slides. No. Since doing it in that mode, it just won't do it in presentation mode. Is that okay with you?
Yeah. We'll bypass some of the animation. No notes. No, they're just animation, but we may have to just bypass the animation.
Okay.
It'll be a little bit smaller, so it'll be.
This may be the best we can do for now. I think people can see it, though.
Whatever works best for the hearing and for the public.
I think this is fine if you all are okay with that.
I think it is fine. All right. So let's, Mr. McCurdy has spelled his name and been sworn in. Go ahead, Ms. Olson.
Good morning, Mr. McCurdy. Can you hear me okay? I'll go closer. Is that better? Okay. Mr. McCurdy, what is your current position?
I'm currently Vice President of Innovation and Sustainability for Select Water Solutions.
And do you have before you what has been marked as NMOGA Exhibit 6? That's NMOGA Exhibit 4.
Yes, I do.
Do you recognize that as your direct technical testimony that was pre-filed in this matter?
Yes, I do.
And was that testimony prepared by you or under your direct supervision?
It was prepared by me.
Do you have any substantive changes to that direct testimony?
No.
Is that direct testimony true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
If you were asked those same questions today under oath, would your responses be the same?
Yes, they would.
And do you also have before you what has been marked as NMOGA Exhibit 11?
Yes.
Do you recognize that as your rebuttal technical testimony that was pre-filed in this matter?
Yes.
Was that testimony also prepared by you or under your direct supervision?
Yes, it was by me.
Do you have any substantive changes to that testimony?
No.
Is that testimony true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
And if you were asked those same questions today under oath, would your responses be the same?
Yes, they would.
So now I'd like to turn to the summaries of Mr. McCurdy's testimony. He's prepared demonstrative PowerPoints to assist with those summaries. Each were uploaded into Dropbox and made available to all parties, the commissioners and the hearing examiner. Mr. McCurdy, I believe the commission has access to your direct testimony and the commissioners have reviewed that. So I'd like to just highlight some of the key points in your direct testimony. But before we get there, can we start with your background? You've provided a copy of your resume as NMOGA Exhibit 7, is that correct?
That is correct.
And again, just highlighting a few areas relevant to the testimony you're providing today, can you briefly summarize your relevant education and professional experience?
Yes, I can. I've already stated my current position. As of this year, I have 44 years of experience in the U.S. oil and gas industry. Primary focus throughout my career has been on oil field chemistry and produced water treatment. Currently, in my role within Select, I represent Select on all of the state and federal associations devoted to looking at produced water. That includes the New Mexico Produced Water Consortium, and I'll speak a little bit deeper about these a little later on in the testimony.
And would you slow down, please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
I'm also represent Select on the Texas Produced Water Consortium, as well as the recently stood up Colorado Produced Water Consortium. And additionally to that, Select is a member, and I represent them on the National Alliance of Water Innovation. During my career, I've given presentations on produced water to the US EPA, the Department of Energy, the Government Accountability Office, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as the Energy Information Agency.
And can you briefly describe Select Water Solutions?
So Select is what is commonly referred to these days as a midstream water provider for the oil and gas industry. This is something that didn't really exist several years ago. Now it is, and what midstream water companies do is they tend to gather in produced water from various operators, clean that water to a condition to where it can be reused in ongoing hydraulic fracturing activities. And where there is not an access or an outlet for that water in completions, then we dispose of that water in Class 2 UIC wells. UIC.
And can you briefly describe your role as Vice President of Innovation and Sustainability?
So I do several different functions within Select. One of them is such as what we're doing here, be an advocate for our industry and help promote that. I've already mentioned that I represent Select on all these produced water consortiums, as well as attend all the associated produced water conferences that are circled around that and present often at those individual things as well. And then a third hat I wear within the company is we have a small team of 4 individuals who are devoted to looking at new technology and innovative technology focused on treatment of produced water. And I'm one of the 4 people in that group that are actively looking at new technology on a day-to-day basis.
And just to clarify for the record, it's a little bit confusing. Is Select a member of NMOGA?
Yes, Select is a member of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. And since you mentioned that, I would like to point that out that I'm here representing NMOGA, not as a representative of Select Water Solutions.
That was going to be my next question. And then briefly, can you just describe your role on each of the state produced water consortiums?
So I'm an active participant within the water consortiums. When New Mexico was originally stood up in 2019, I was there for that event rollout and have been a member of several of those different working groups within the consortium since then. I've also been involved with the Texas consortium since the day it was stood up and am active on all of their different governing groups, as well as their stakeholder board. And then the newest one, the Colorado is a little different. It was really heavily structured by their legislature, and it has a finite number of individuals. You're only allowed 33 seats, and you have to be appointed. And I'm one of 4 appointed seats representing expertise in produced water.
Mr. McCurdy, I'd like to now turn to the substance of your direct testimony. Can you please provide us a summary of the purposes of your direct testimony?
Yes. The testimony I provided is, as I said, supporting NMOGA's position on the proposed Part 8 through my testimony as follows. Number 1, historical treatment of produced water in the United States and current discharge of treated produced water in various areas.
Mr. McCurdy, slow down.
Okay. State and federal efforts to promote and regulate use of treated produced water. And lastly, the potential role of produced water in the production of hydrogen as a source of green energy.
And as mentioned, the commission has access to your full direct testimony. So I just want to go through some of the key points on each of those issues. Can you please summarize the highlights of your testimony on historical and current discharges of produced water?
Yes, I can. Briefly, just history, and I think it's been mentioned before. Wyoming has been allowing discharge of treated produced water for decades now. But to be fair, this is a relatively low TDS water. It generally is associated with unconventional coal bed methane production. And typically in many areas, the coal seam where it comes up into the ground, that is the source of groundwater for those particular areas. The Fayetteville Shale, that was an attempt in the 2010, not an attempt, but a successful attempt in the 2010s, where an operator was using a distillation process referred to as vacuum distillation, mechanical vapor recompression to treat Fayetteville shale water. And then eventually, once approved through a whole effluent toxicity test, that water would be discharged into the White River. That has since no longer occurred, as the Fayetteville shale eventually become an unproductive play in the U.S. And then lastly, ongoing to this day in the Marcellus Shale, an water treatment operator in Wysox, Pennsylvania, is also using that BD/MBR process I just mentioned, along with full crystallization to take Marcellus Shale water all the way down to a solid salt. The distillate from that process has to meet a set of 39 criteria established by the Commonwealth that's referred to as WMGR 123, Appendix A, which I'll show here in a minute. Once you meet that criteria, it is relabeled as a beneficial reuse water, and then they, through a NPDES permit, are able to discharge that water into the Susquehanna River. And that is currently ongoing today. Let's see. And here are the 39 constituents under the WMGR 123 Appendix A that's established by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Just because of some of the previous testimony, I'd like to draw everybody's attention. There is a requirement on here for radium, and that in order to be discharged, radium has to be below 5 picocuries per liter.
Okay, and similarly, can you walk us through a couple of the key points on your testimony on current state and federal efforts toward beneficial use of treated produced water?
Yes, I can. So briefly, we've talked about the New Mexico Consortium. I would like to take a minute to congratulate New Mexico. You were the first state to set up a research consortium focused on produced water and have done a wonderful job in doing that. Several of the other states that I will be talking about here are following your lead and really paying close attention to what has been developed within this consortium. This consortium, as you're aware, was announced in the fall of 2019. It's a joint effort between the New Mexico Environment Department and New Mexico State University. Primary focus has been the potential to safely augment existing freshwater supplies with desalinated and polished produced water. Next up was Texas. Texas Senate Bill SB 601 established the Texas Produced Water Consortium hosted at Texas Tech University. Their first year deliverable was a white paper on feasibility of safely using treated produced water outside of oil and gas. And I was part of the group that helped contribute to that white paper that went to the legislature. They're currently in their second year. The second year is devoted to an RFP to select pilot projects to support with analytical testing. I was part of the group that helped set up that RFP and evaluate the responses to that RFP. Some of those pilot projects have been carried out and they're in the process of going through the analytical phase now. And I would like to note that there was a 3-tiered analytical process developed by New Mexico State or by the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. And the Texas Consortium did use that exact 3-tiered approach for their analysis process for the pilot projects that they were overseeing in Texas. And then lastly, I mentioned the Colorado Consortium. It's the newest. It's in its first year of operation at present. This consortium is, like I said, a little bit more structured. It falls under the Division of Energy and Carbon Management in Colorado, which is a part of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Their first year, numerous deliverables almost monthly or every other month back to the legislature regarding different aspects of produced water. The initial focus has been minimizing freshwater usage in oil and gas operations because they're not quite advanced in that area as both New Mexico and Texas are. The later focus, probably mid-year next year, will be to focus on the potential to treat and beneficially use produced water outside of oil and gas operations. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier on the slide, the National Alliance of Water Innovation, commonly referred to as NAWI. This was established in 2020 with a 5-year, $110 million DOE grant. It is hosted at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There are 14 university partners plus Oak Ridge National Lab. New Mexico State University is a member. Additionally, Bergendorf is an aligned research partner of this association. The focus has been on improved desal for 11 different water streams, with 3 of those associated with oil and gas. The DOE apparently liked what was occurring at NAWI because this past year they received an additional $75 million extension for another 5 years.
And for the benefit of the court reporter transcribing, can you, I believe Bergendorf is an acronym, can you provide that?
It is the Brackish Groundwater National Desalinization Research Facility, and it is here in Alamogordo, New Mexico.
Thank you. And finally, I think your testimony provides a lot of detailed information about green hydrogen production. Can you summarize the key points of your testimony addressing produced water as a potential source of water for green hydrogen production?
Yes, I can. There's a tremendous amount of interest these days in hydrogen, and that's primarily due to the fact that within the Inflation Reduction Act, there was an opportunity to get up to a $3 per kilogram credit for hydrogen production, provided you could meet certain criteria with regard to release of carbon dioxide. Without going into all the details in this, it would be appropriate to mention that apparently at this point in time, and I'm going to briefly discuss the various forms of hydrogen production and how they go by color, but green hydrogen will likely be the only hydrogen that will qualify for this $3 per kilogram credit. It should point out that if you applied for this credit and received it, if you applied for this credit and received it, you would receive this credit for a period of 10 years, provided that the production of the plant or the construction of the plant that was going to generate this hydrogen occurs before 2033. I won't go into all these. Depending on how hydrogen is produced and depending on what you do with any associated carbon dioxide that is produced with it, that determines how you label a hydrogen with a color. For the purpose of this discussion today, let's just stick with green. Green is hydrogen that is produced through an electrical process called electrolysis, where you essentially are going to take pure water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen and recover the both. But the electricity used for this process must come from renewable sources, such as wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. It cannot come off the grid and not still be considered green hydrogen. I won't bore the commission with going into all the stoichiometry of how hydrogen is produced and how much water is required for some of the different types. But what I would like to point out is we're referring to green hydrogen. I've already talked about those first 2 bullet points. Just from a chemical standpoint, you need 9 kilograms of water for every 1 kilogram of hydrogen that's produced. But That's not everything. You're also going to need water for, it's a very heat extensive process. You're going to need water for cooling throughout this process. Typically, a green hydrogen production process needs somewhere between 16 and 25 gallons of water for every 1 kilogram of hydrogen that's produced. This may be a little bit hard of an example to everyone to read, particularly in this small format, but it's a diagram that illustrates all the pathways in green hydrogen production where water is needed and where water is rejected. You will have a concentrated stream off some of these processes that will come out and have to go to disposal. And as I mentioned, there's going to be a considerable amount that's used for cooling throughout the process. In this example here, they use reverse osmosis, regardless of what water source you start with, whether it be municipal, surface, groundwater. It would have to go through reverse osmosis first to ensure it was to a quality ready to be moved to an electrodialysis process. Electrodialysis process is what will ultimately get it to what we will talk about later is ultra pure water, which is what is needed for hydrogen production. I'd like to point out here that many of the thermal distillation process, membrane distillation process that we discuss regarding produced water could be substituted for this reverse osmosis process here and give you a distillate water that would be suitable to go into that electrodialysis unit or electrodeionization, sorry. In this example here, I believe we've got 59 kilograms of water on the front end to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen coming out of this plant. Again, a lot of information here that I prepared previously for a conference that I had attended, but let's focus on green hydrogen, which is the bottom row that has data in it. For green hydrogen, we're going to need somewhere between 380 and 600 barrels. And I apologize, but that's the world I live in and think constantly in terms of barrels of water, which is 42 gallons of water in the US. But somewhere between 600 barrels of water for every metric ton of hydrogen that's going to be produced. Now, if we were to look at oil and gas produced water, we on average in the Permian Basin believe that we could get about a 50% recovery of a distillate out of this produced water. So if we had a plant that was going to produce 100 metric tons per day of hydrogen, we would need somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 to 140,000 barrels of produced water a day to be treated to provide the water for that plant. Just briefly, I talked green hydrogen, what it does. We use these what are called PEM membranes, proton exchange membranes. That is what is used to split that H2O into hydrogen and oxygen. We have to put ultra pure water up against these membranes or they will foul very quickly and have to be replaced, and they are very expensive. Ultra pure water is commonly defined as 18.2 meg ohm, OHM, resistivity measurement. With this kind of resistivity, this water cannot conduct an electric current. I oftentimes say that if we had a wading pool of this water in here, you could stand in it barefoot and I could drop a toaster in that was plugged in and you would not feel any harm, because there are no salts or electrolytes in the water to conduct electricity. TDS, the total dissolved solids of this water, is typically measured in nanograms or picograms per liter. Now, approximately 1/2 of the needed water at these plants will be for electrolyzers. The other half will be used for cooling. That water will not have to be treated quite to this quality. We can probably get by with something in the neighborhood of 250 milligrams per liter, which would still be a relatively low TDS water. If produced water was used, then we could take the concentrate back from that cooling process and either dispose of it in a class 2 UIC well, or reuse it to be used in ongoing hydraulic fracturing completions. One of the reasons there's such a strong demand and strong interest, particularly in New Mexico, for green hydrogen is here's a map prepared by the National Renewable Energy Lab that demonstrates the best areas in the U.S. for both solar and wind renewable energy production. Obviously, if you look at the map, particularly the eastern side of New Mexico tends to fall into that desirable category for renewable energy production. However, there is one small problem with that. I just pulled a typical drought monitor map from roughly 1 year ago. And as you see that eastern 1/3 of New Mexico, and as I'm sure many of y'all are aware, it's not a question of if it's going to be in a drought, it's a question of when it's going to be a drought. It's just a question of how, right? So how? Because it's very common for the eastern half of New Mexico as well as the western part of Texas to commonly be in drought conditions, meaning that we have a scarcity water issue. I believe this is the last slide I have on hydrogen production. I'd like to point out that the current U.S. hydrogen production is roughly 10 million metric tons per year. However, the projected growth for hydrogen in the U.S., particularly in light of these incentives that have been put in place for it, is expected to grow by 55% between now and 2030, which could put us approximately in the U.S. at a hydrogen production rate of 220 million metric tons per year by the year 2030. Now, if that's all green hydrogen production, and that alone would require between 454 and 721 million barrels per day of treated water. And to put it in more common hydrological terms, somewhere in the neighborhood of 58,000 to 93,000 acre feet of water per day for the hydrogen production in the U.S.
Thank you. And just to recap, can you please provide the summary conclusions from your direct testimony?
So with regards to my concluding remarks, New Mexico is currently leading all other states in researching beneficial use of a highly treated produced water. And again, you're to be commended for taking the lead on that. Using treated produced water for hydrogen production would offer economic development opportunities to the state, but would not alleviate future freshwater concerns. Using treated produced water to offset current freshwater usage does. If we can treat produced water to an ultra-pure status, and we can, why would it not be possible for industry to treat to a level that was set for safe for discharge? NMOGA does not believe that there is a basis for banning discharge of a treated produced water at this time, as the New Mexico Environment Department can simply deny a permit request under the existing regulatory framework if they are not satisfied with the quality of the treated water. And then lastly, I would like to thank the Water Quality Control Commission for the opportunity to present direct testimony on behalf of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association for consideration regarding the proposed rule.
I'm just going to switch to your rebuttal PowerPoint quickly. I may have to.
Ms. Olson, we're going to need a break soon. Would this be a good time?
Sure. I anticipate this would be another 20 minutes. So if we want to take a break.
Let's take a break
that sounds
now.
great.
All right, let's come back at 11. Okay, let's come back from the break, please. All right, Ms. Olson, I see you have you're sharing slides for Mr. McCurdy's rebuttal testimony. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we've finished direct testimony. Moving on to the summary of your rebuttal. Can you briefly provide the purpose of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I can.
You can skip through this.
I think, okay, I'm just going to briefly say I'm submitting rebuttal testimony on behalf of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and I've previously provided this written, which is, actually, this is NMOGA Exhibit 11.
Yeah.
On the slide here, it says NMOGA Exhibit 4, but my rebuttal was actually NMOGA Exhibit 11. All right, so the purpose of my rebuttal is to respond to the direct testimony of the New Mexico Environment Department and other parties to this proceeding. I will address their testimony focused on 4 topics. Topic 1, contention that there is no way of knowing what contaminants may be in produced water. Topic 2, federal and state bans on discharge of produced water, particularly from hydraulically fractured wells. Topic 3, disparity of peer-reviewed papers on untreated produced water versus papers on treatment and use of a highly treated and polished produced water. And again, talk briefly about the quality of water needed for green hydrogen production.
And Mr. McCurdy, can you please identify the documents and information that you reviewed and relied on in preparing your rebuttal testimony?
So I have reviewed the proposed regulation. I have reviewed the written direct technical testimony and exhibits related to topics covered in my direct testimony submitted by the following: the New Mexico Environment Department, Amigos Bravos and Sierra Club, New Energy Economy, Wild Earth Guardians. I have reviewed numerous peer-reviewed published studies focused on quality and utilization of treated produced water. Several examples are provided as NMOGA exhibits 75 through 127.
And Mr. McCurdy, briefly regarding the papers that you identified and attached to your to NMOGA's NOI and your rebuttal testimony, can you explain how you selected the papers that you identified?
Okay. Yes, I can. Some of the stuff or some of the papers and exhibits that we included were projects that I worked on, along with others, such as the Groundwater Protections Council's 300+ page report on produced water. Several of them I helped participate in gathering data for and stuff, though I was not an author. And then other of the papers were one. Part of my job is to routinely keep up with papers that are being published and put out regarding advances in produced water treatment. And so I tend to gather those, keep them on file, read them. The ones that particularly really apply to what my company or others around me may be looking at, I read thoroughly. Others that may have advanced one small part of a piece of the puzzle, I'll tend to scan and keep copies of them.
And Mr. McCurdy, have each of these papers gone through the peer review process and been accepted and published in a journal?
Yes, of the papers that I submitted as exhibits for this testimony or for this hearing, everyone has went through a peer review process.
And have you personally reviewed each of these papers?
Yes, I have, and I have notes regarding each one of the papers. What were some of the significant findings, and what were the focus of the papers?
Okay, I'd like to turn to your rebuttal opinions. To give us a roadmap, can you please just summarize your rebuttal opinions?
Absolutely. We'll start with New Mexico Environment Department can evaluate and deny discharge requests for produced water under existing regulatory framework. Technical testimony submitted by New Mexico Environment Department and others does not support a statewide ban on discharge of treated produced water at this time. Adopting such a ban would only extend the time for New Mexico to possibly access a new water source for the state. This is due in part to the time and effort needed to repeal such a ban once analytical data suitable to NMED was available. Other states who have authorized or considered authorization have done so without the need for an upfront ban.
And similar to your direct testimony, the commission has access to your full written rebuttal testimony. So I just want to stick to the key highlights of the issues you've identified. Can you briefly summarize your testimony refuting other participants' testimony on unknown contaminants in produced water and unavailability of analytic techniques for contaminants in produced water?
Yes, I can. So with regard to that, the direct testimony of meaning, including NMED, that discharge is not possible as approved analytical techniques are not available for many contaminants in the high salt matrix produced water. My response is on down two possible avenues. One, reduce the salt content of produced water so more approved analytical techniques are available for characterization of the produced water. And utilize newer instrumentation that's coming online that allows for more thorough characterization of the treated produced water. There's a concept out there that's been discussed. It's been discussed with the EPA and they're interested in it. The most common method of determining effluent guidelines is you have to know what's in the wastewater precisely up front to where you can develop guidelines. The high salt matrix of produced water makes that difficult, but industry is not going to intentionally discharge a high salt or a high TDS produced water. One of the things that's going to have to be done is through a desalinization process, we're going to remove or reduce the amount of salt that's in that water. Once we do that, many analytical techniques are available out there to look at that, what I would refer to as desalinated produced water. Once you take a look at that water, you will be able to set effluent guidelines for either a dischargeable produced permeate or distillate, which would be a desalinated produced water that now meets discharge criteria. In addition, new instruments and techniques are improving analysis of produced water, particularly for unknown contaminants. Among these are high performance liquid chromatography, as well as mass spec instrumentation with time of flight analysis. These instruments enable us to look at contaminants down to the nanogram per milliliter or picogram per milliliter concentration accurately. And now we have talked about non-targeted analysis. These are instrumentations that you don't tell them what to go look for. They just go look for anything in the water. They take the results of that search and then it gets parsed through newer databases that have organic structures identified in them. And they're able to match up those unidentified compounds with those organic structures and give us a definition of what that is. These are done through a process called ultra high performance liquid chromatography. And I mentioned the software and databases have been developed to go hand in hand with that. New Mexico State University has used non-targeted analysis in the new software on a distilled and highly polished produced water. That's been this past year. Out of that analysis, they did identify 12 unknown composites in the distillate. However, all 12 of those were in the picogram per milliliter range. So somewhere in the 1 part per billion or slightly above range.
And I believe the next section of your rebuttal testimony responds to NMED and other party testimony addressing regulation on discharge of treated produced water in other jurisdictions. Can you please provide the highlights of your testimony on that issue?
So when we look at potential bans, what exists currently is there is a federal ban on discharge of an unconventional produced water to publicly owned treatment works facilities in the U.S. This resulted from untreated unconventional water in the Marcellus. Historically, many of the operators up in the area, that's how they'd handled their produced water, because if you're not aware, the Commonwealth does not have a good disposal network within the state. There's actually I think now today, 8 disposal wells all throughout the state. Conventional operators would take their produced water to a public POTW. It would go through minimal treatment within that facility and then be discharged along with municipal waste into a riverway. As the Marcellus was developed, unconventional operators were doing the same thing and handing their water off. Studies demonstrated that downstream of these effluents, they were starting to see things that were characteristically found in produced water in the stream bed sediments, such as barium, strontium, radium. That's led the EPA to ban that practice. Should have never been done to start with. Also, California has a ban on water from hydraulically fractured wells being used for irrigation. However, California for decades now has been allowing conventional produced water to be used for irrigation. And with regards to hydraulic fracturing, we often seem to think that that's something that's relatively new. But oil and gas wells in the U.S. have been stimulated via hydraulic fracturing since 1947. The majority of the wells producing in the Permian Basin that have been drilled since the 1950s have all been hydraulically fractured, whether conventional or unconventional. States do allow discharge of some volume of produced water, and we've talked about these previously. Wyoming has done it in the past, though this was unconventional coal bed methane, relatively low TDS water. And then we discussed currently what's going on in Pennsylvania, where a Marcellus shale water is being treated, taken to salt with the distillate meeting those 39 criteria I mentioned earlier, and that water being discharged to the Susquehanna River. Additionally, I would like to point out that our sister state to the east of us here, Texas, the Texas Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, has recently approved a discharge of a treated produced water for South Texas, relatively small discharge, less than 400 barrels of water a day. They have a second discharge permit for the same area that's currently under final draft review. They have 2 additional permits that are going through the review process now. One will be for a 20,000 barrel a day discharge into the Pecos River tributary north of Pecos, Texas. And the last one is a request for a permit to dispose of a maximum of 400,000 barrels of treated water per day into Red Bluff Reservoir just south of the state line. I would encourage the New Mexico Environment Department to collaborate with TCEQ on Pecos River discharge parameters. If that water can be treated to a status acceptable to TCEQ, this would allow NMED to follow the same criteria and allow for discharge into the Pecos River on the New Mexico side, thus aiding the state in meeting the Pecos River compact requirements.
Mr. McCurdy, the third section of your rebuttal, I think we're on, responds to NMED and other party testimony regarding availability of peer-reviewed published research addressing water quality treatment and utilization of treated produced water. Can you please provide the highlights of that testimony?
Yes, and one of the things I would like to point out is the disparity between the number of papers addressing effects from raw produced water versus a produced water that has been treated to a low TDS quality and with removal of organics and other contaminants. The majority of published papers out there, peer-reviewed papers over the last decade and a half, have been focused on raw produced water and the effects that it could possibly have to the environment. Fewer papers were focused on the potential to recover a beneficial water from that produced water, primarily due to the fact that disposal was relatively cheap and abundant, and that was considered a perfect option for that produced water. There was not a consideration amongst operators to consider looking at potential treatment to reduce disposal volumes and recover fresh water. A couple of things have changed that. Number one is we've seen induced seismicity. We're currently seeing it just south of the state line here in New Mexico. But previous to that, it has followed this unconventional development is these larger water volumes required disposal. When the Barnett Shale was initially in its heyday in North Texas, we had 2 disposal wells there linked to induced seismicity. A few years later, as the Fayetteville Shale that I mentioned earlier was kicked off in Arkansas, again, 2 disposal wells there were linked to induced seismicity. Many of you may be aware that Oklahoma went through a rash of seismic events back in the mid, say 2013, 2014 period, which ultimately resulted in the Mississippi Lime being a uneventful play because it required a lot of water disposal, and yet the water was going into wells that were contributing to induced seismicity. Now we're down and it's Texas' turn. We've had 3 active seismic areas within Texas. A 4th one just recently popped up, which was interesting. The one east of Snyder, Texas, because there is no unconventional development over there. So in conjunction with induced concerns with induced seismicity, and then also with concerns that when we look at various state future water plans, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, all of those states have concerns over whether or not they were going to have fresh water to meet the demands of the citizens of the state in the future. That is what is leading us today to see more and more papers. So I would I'm opposed to the concept that there are no peer-reviewed papers out there that look at treatment of produced water, highly treated produced water, and what can be done. Thus why I've submitted several of those papers as NMOGA exhibits 75 to 127, because those papers do exist.
And addressing those papers recently, and again, these are the exhibits identified on page 11 of your rebuttal testimony, and also listed and provided with NMOGA's rebuttal NOI, NMOGA exhibits 75 through 127. So we've gone over your familiarity with these papers. Can you please explain the purpose of identifying these papers in your rebuttal testimony and providing them as exhibits in this proceeding?
So the purpose, as I mentioned, was to make sure the commission is aware that there is research ongoing about the possibility of recovering a low TDS beneficial water from a produced brine. We understand the concerns that have been presented here earlier by some groups about the contaminants that are in produced water. I would like to point out that when you go through these treatment process, typically it's a train. There's a pre-treatment process on the front end. There is a distillation process in the middle. And then there is typically a polishing process on the end, depending on what particular contaminants you're targeting. But if most of the contaminants that have been discussed from a concernable standpoint, radium, uranium being one, do not make it through processes. I just recently referenced the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's WMGR 123 Appendix A. You have to be below 5 picocuries per liter in order to discharge that water.
And can you please provide for the commission the high-level takeaways from these papers?
High-level takeaways from many of the papers demonstrate that water can be effectively, either through a membrane distillation or a thermal distillation process, can be polished to a point to where we recover some volume of a very good, clean, low TDS water that could be beneficially used. We believe some of the papers that were submitted there demonstrated through greenhouse studies how this water could potentially benefit growth of plants in a given area in irrigation.
And Mr. McCurdy, are the papers you selected and included with NMOGA's rebuttal NOI intended to be an exhaustive list of published research on developments in characterization, treatment, and utilization of treated produced water?
No, it is not. I did not have the time to put that exhaustive list together. There are hundreds of papers, peer-reviewed papers out there that have been published looking at the potential to recover this low TDS water. One of the technologies I'm a fan of, membrane distillation, there are over 200 papers associated with the results from different membrane distillation lab and research pilot tests regarding treatment of produced water.
And finally, moving on to your last topic covered, do you have any additional points you want to state from your rebuttal testimony regarding quality of water needed for green hydrogen?
So I will try not to be redundant on some of the information that I provided earlier regarding green hydrogen. Just would like to point out that green hydrogen can be produced through many different methods. We're focusing on green here today because that's the one that would garner the largest credit through the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, green hydrogen uses electricity along with a proton exchange membrane to separate a water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen being gathered. Again, I talked about ultra pure water and what condition that water had to be to where you could use it with these proton exchange membranes. And I did point out that the other quality of water would be needed for cooling, but it would not necessarily have to be released to the environment once you were done with the cooling process. It could be returned back to oil and gas operation. Again, I will not go all the way through all the requirements. I would point out for ultra pure water a couple of additional necessary needs. The total organic carbon of that water must be less than 10 picograms per liter, and the bacteria count for that water must be less than 10 colony forming units per milliliter. I would also like to point out, because people have said, well, instead of produced water, we could utilize fresh or brackish water for hydrogen production, and that is true. However, both of those are going to have to go through an extensive cleaning process prior to being handed off to that electrode deionization unit. And if that's the case, then why not use produced water and put it through a distillation process and utilize it? I've oftentimes, and just so you'll know, I grew up on a small farm just east of Midland, Texas. The water well that we had at our farm was drilled into a brackish aquifer. We could not drink it. We could irrigate with it. And what I tell communities is the brackish water is your lifeline. When we get to a position to where fresh water is not available for the community, that's the easiest source for a community to find water and treat it, is that brackish water, or if you're going to do it for consumption. So save that brackish water wherever you can.
Thank you, Mr. McCurdy. And can you please just provide the conclusions briefly from your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I will. Thank you. New Mexico is currently leading all other states in researching beneficial use of a highly treated produced water. Again, you should be commended on that. There is no technically supportable basis for banning discharge of a treated produced water. The technology exists to take produced water to an ultra pure status. And if that is possible, why would we not consider that water would be suitable for discharge to the environment? In fact, That water would be so pure that if we were going to use it for irrigation, we would have to add some minerals back into it prior to it being used for irrigation. Lastly, again, I would like to thank the Water Quality Control Commission for the opportunity to present this rebuttal testimony on behalf of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association.
Madam Hearing Officer, that concludes the summaries. I do have a very brief line of questioning on Sir rebuttal before I tender him for cross-examination.
That's fine.
Mr. McCurdy, the first topic that I want to briefly address in Sir rebuttal is the need for additional research. One of the department's positions throughout this hearing, echoed by other parties, that there simply is not sufficient data on characterization of produced water to allow the commission to pass a rule at this time that opens the door for possibility of discharge. At the hearing specifically, the department witnesses witnesses from other parties pointed to the Danforth paper, which I believe is NMED Exhibit 133, to support these positions regarding variability and unknowns of produced water. Are you familiar with Dr. Danforth's literature review?
Yes, I am.
And do you have a response to that rebuttal testimony relying on Dr. Danforth's literature review to support the rule proposed?
Yes, I do. And I would like to state for the record that Dr. Chloe Danforth is a friend. I've known her for numerous years, going back to her time with Environmental Defense Fund. And in my previous role with Chesapeake Energy Corporation, we work closely with Environmental Defense Fund on a number of projects. However, a couple of things I would like to point out about this Dr. Danforth's paper. One is it was a literature review focused on all the potential contaminants that could be found in produced water. This was literally across the United States. That doesn't mean that those contaminants are all going to be found in the Permian Basin, because it was focused on the Marcellus and different areas and such as that. Of that literature, some of those contaminants were only found in one piece of literature article. It doesn't mean it was found all throughout everything else. There was a large focus on the fact that, if I remember the number correctly, that out of the 1,200 plus contaminants listed in the literature, there was only toxicological information available for, I believe, 170 of those, thus raising a concern about all the others that we did not have information on. Two things to point out: just because toxicology information doesn't exist doesn't mean that that particular contaminant poses a toxicological hazard. Number two, that is raw, untreated, produced water. Many of the contaminants listed in that paper would not make it through this treatment process I just described of pre-treatment, distillation, and polishing. Therefore, we only need to worry about any contaminants that could make it through that process. The instrumentation available to look at produced water when this paper was produced is not as accurate as it is today. Thus, I believe the research that's currently being done today, as I referenced earlier for New Mexico State University, is allowing us to really zero in on any potential unknown contaminants that could possibly make it through this treatment process. It was a valuable paper and a lot of effort went into it. Once again, Dr. Danforth is a friend, and I commend her for all the work that she put into that paper.
And carrying on with the papers and questions about available research, we discussed the journal research papers that you provided with your rebuttal. I think you've alluded to other projects that you're aware of through your experiences on the New Mexico Consortium, as well as your professional responsibilities. Is that accurate that there's new additional research addressing the variability and characterization of produced water supporting safe utilization of treated produced water?
Yes, and I've mentioned several times, I'll reiterate it again today. I think New Mexico State's taking a wonderful lead in a lot of this and the analysis that they're doing, but other academic institutions are as well, both here within the state, in Colorado, and in Texas as well.
And briefly regarding the ongoing research from the New Mexico Consortium, which I think is the New Mexico State research that you've alluded to, has the New Mexico Consortium presented on some of this new research?
Yes, just recently with the New Mexico Consortium's mid-year review, there was a presentation given on some of the latest research that they've done regarding a distilled and highly polished produced water from one of the pilots. That presentation was again referenced with this State of the Science Symposium that was hosted by NMED here back several weeks ago. And I also believe that presentation is scheduled to be presented next week at the Produced Water Society's Permian Basin Conference in Midland.
And Mr. McCurdy, were you present at that State of the Science Conference for those presentations?
Yes, I was. I was present at the State of the Science Conference, as well as I spoke on a panel there during the symposium.
And I believe you said that that conference was maybe hosted by the New Mexico Environment Department?
That is correct.
And so this may be self-evident, but were members of the New Mexico Environment Department there for those presentations?
Yeah, yes, they were. All the way from Secretary Kinney to several individuals underneath him were there at that symposium.
Okay, thank you. That's the questions I had on that topic. Turning to my other topic of rebuttal, regulation of discharge and pilot projects in Texas. And this is in part intended to be responsive to Commissioners Thompson and Armstrong questioning of Ms. Courier. So going way back to day 2 of this hearing, the department witnesses provided testimony in response to questions from, I think it was Commissioner Dominguez, regarding Texas's approach for reuse of treated produced water for projects on land applications. She suggested in that testimony that Texas allows for demonstration projects for a very limited amount of time, both based on your knowledge and experience with the Texas Produced Water Consortium and your professional responsibilities. Are you familiar with the this process that the department witnesses were testifying to?
Yes, I am.
And just to provide some clarity and background, is it your understanding that the Texas Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over land applications?
Yes, I do. Currently, it's clearly delineated within Texas that the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality will have jurisdiction over all surface applications, surface discharge of a treated produced water to a waterway or a surface or a water body. Currently, the Texas Railroad Commission is taking the lead on jurisdiction over any land application of a treated produced water.
Okay, and going back to Ms. Fulham's testimony. Go ahead, sorry. No, please.
I would state that that could change in the future. They have a kind of a memorandum of understanding between the two groups now that that's how they're going to let it proceed for now. These are, and we're going to get into the details on that in a minute, but as these grow to a larger future project, that could change with TCEQ taking a more stronger role.
And going back to Ms. Fulham's testimony at hearing, and I'm attributing it to her, I believe there are other department witnesses who chimed in on this. The demonstration projects regarding land application that she was talking about, is it your understanding that is before the Railroad Commission?
Yes, it is. The Railroad Commission currently is, they're not really referring to them as a permit. They're referring to them as a letter of authorization. which would allow these land applications of the treated produced water on a small scale. They tend to be 5 to 10 acres or smaller, but they are taking jurisdiction over or setting up those letters of authorization.
And can you elaborate on the duration of those projects?
Yeah, that once you receive a letter of authorization, it's good for 1 year. There's certain criteria within that LOA, monitoring requirements for the land application. Not only that, but when you apply for it, you have to demonstrate this is what we're going to do. This is the plan of the project. This is what we're going to monitor. This is how we're going to take soil samples and take a look at effects to the soil. LOAs are good for 1 year. However, at the end of 1 year, you are allowed to apply for a 1-year extension.
And has the Railroad Commission actually provided authorization for projects?
Yes,
this program?
yes, they have. The first one was done roughly, a letter of authorization came out a year ago. However, there's a conflict between the technology provider and the landowner that has resulted in that moving forward. But there now are other applications before the Railroad Commission that they are considering now, at looking at different projects. There has been one carried out so far, looking at a much smaller, like a 1 acre alfalfa plot.
And addressing only these Railroad Commission authorized projects for land application. I believe your testimony was these are smaller scale projects. Are you aware of the approximate level of investment for these studies?
So I believe it's been discussed in here a few times during this hearing. There are analytical requirements of the water quality that's going to be discharged. These are these full-blown suites that we talked about earlier, the 3-tiered approach. Typically, those are $15,000 a piece to do that. There's multiple of those that are required throughout the pilot project. In addition, depending on the size of the unit, small scale unit could be relatively cheap, like $100,000 to build a pilot. A larger one that say was going to produce 500 barrels of produced water or treated produced water per day. There's one of those piloting right now, not on a land application, just piloting on testing water just outside of Midland, that I'm personally aware the capital cost of that unit was well in excess of $5 million.
And Mr. McCurdy, now turning to the discharge permits that you referenced in your rebuttal testimony, that you testified are currently under the jurisdiction of the Texas Department of Environmental Quality, TCEQ. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And this is different from the pilot studies referenced by in the department testimony that you discussed. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And these are larger scale projects. Is that correct?
That is correct. The ones that I referenced earlier regarding the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality discharge permits, these are not pilot projects. These are larger scale. The two I mentioned for South Texas are not pilot projects. It's just they're not treating that much water. So there tend to be less than 400 barrels of water per day being discharged.
And this again may be self-evident, but I'm assuming these discharge permits have conditions.
Absolutely. That's the way TCQ is set up. Typically applying for one of these permits, you have to supply their requested suite of information regarding what is the raw produced water, as well as analysis of the treated produced water to demonstrate what you would be intending to discharge. If my memory serves me correctly, you're required to do this 4 times throughout the permitting process to do that. So and then once a permit is applied, depending on the size of the project, receiving body that it's going into, the TCEQ will dictate, here's what we want you to sample, and here's how often we want you to do the sampling.
And based on your experience sitting on the consortium of Texas. Is Texas looking to the monitoring and reporting data from these projects as another source of information regarding reuse of produced water, informing reuse of produced water?
Yes, they are. Texas is in the similar process to New Mexico right now, is doing the best they can to gather as much data as possible from these pilot projects and these ongoing permitting projects once they're actually up and running, to generate as large a database as possible.
And do you have a sense of the level of investment for these larger scale projects?
So when I'm looking at technology available for these larger projects and fabricating equipment to reach these type of volumes, I have an ideal number in mind from a capital investment. Ideally, I would like to spend no more than $1 million for 1,000 barrels of distillate provided on a daily basis. That's an ideal number. Many of the various technologies we've looked at do not reach that level, but that's a goal. But let's just look at that goal. If I had a plant that was going to discharge 10,000 barrels of treated water per day, the capital for that plant would be $10 million, ideally. Not to mention operating costs, just the capital investment. There are one of the discharge permit requested for the Pecos tributary just north of Pecos. That's a 20,000 barrel per day discharge. So at a minimum, that company will be looking at least a $20 million capital investment. There's another company I'm aware of that is considering the possibility of a plant that will produce 30,000 barrels of treated produced water per day. Again, most likely a minimum of $30 million investment. So these are going to be large scale infrastructure investments on the part of the oil and gas industry.
Are you aware of whether NMOGA members are considering pilots or projects on the scale you've discussed for Texas?
Yes, they are. It's obviously in southeastern New Mexico, particularly in the Delaware Basin. Everyone's well aware that there's a large volume of produced water that moves from New Mexico into the Texas side, across into the Texas side of the border for disposal. That disposal is being very restricted. All deep well disposal has essentially been shut in what is referred to in that North Culberson Reeves seismic response area. And so New Mexico producers, members of NMOGA, are getting very concerned about the availability of long-term disposal in that area to keep up with oil and gas activities. So many of those operators are looking at these potential treatment pilots as a way to help alleviate some of those disposal concerns.
In addition to the investment of money that you've spoken to, as another benefit of these projects, if they're happening in New Mexico, contribution of data and information regarding or related to treated produced water.
Rephrase that again.
Sorry, did a bad job on that one. In addition to investment, are there other benefits to these projects for providing data to the state on related to reuse of produced water?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously the data that comes out of these pilots and out of these projects will be valuable in determining that this can be done safely for the environment and for the citizenry of the state. As I mentioned earlier, particularly if we're in the Delaware Basin, if surface water discharge was allowed to the Pecos Water tributary, and as you're well aware, once you get below Malaga, that water in that river is basically unsuitable for anything. Typically 7,000 milligrams per liter. You get milligrams per liter, sorry. A Red Bluff Reservoir, I believe, is closer, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15,000 milligrams per liter now. So not really suitable for any freshwater fish. So any amount of a lower TDS water coming into that water stream would likely be beneficial to it, as well as again, there is a compact between New Mexico and Texas regarding or requiring a certain amount of water to move from the state of New Mexico through the Pecos River into the state of Texas. Free to produce water could help with that compact requirement.
And if the Water Quality Control Commission were to adopt the proposal before them, which puts a moratorium on discharges of produced water, will that have a chilling effect on investments in the large-scale demonstration projects that are needed to advance that research in New Mexico?
So I would not flippantly, but I would say that just common sense, the answer to that would be yes. If you have an operator or you have a service company that's going to provide one of these treatment facilities and they have activities both in New Mexico and in Texas, and all of a sudden it seems like Texas is more acceptable to taking a look at this process and New Mexico is more opposed to it, then the investment dollars will move into these projects in Texas.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. McCurdy. I would now pass you for cross-examination or examination by the commission and then cross-examination by.
Have we already admitted exhibits 4 and 11?
Madam Hearing Examiner, I was going to wait to the end of his testimony to move for exhibits because some of them have been objected to, but I'm happy to proceed as you ask.
No, that's fine. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes. Commissioner Zemlich, would you like to start off the questions?
I don't have any questions at this time. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you. Commissioner Fry?
Thank you. So I'm really interested in how Texas is proceeding with oversight and reporting in the cases that you described. So is it they receive a letter of authorization? Is that to an actual permit request or what is their process?
So for the Railroad Commission, you do make a request directly to them. Ideally, they would like that request to come to a landowner who says, we are willing to host this demonstration project. Along with that, though, whichever company is providing the technology and providing the produced water, they have a requirement to include that information within that LOA request. And then the Railroad Commission will consider it, make sure all the boxes are checked regarding what they are requiring to do. And then they will go through the process. And then once they do that, they approve the letter of authorization. The one or two I've seen so far have been approvals straight to the landowner to move forward.
Okay, thank you. And then just in terms of terminology, you talk about land application. I believe New Mexico would call that surface discharge then.
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. Let's see here. So in the case of the rules as proposed, they want to set up a notice of intent process. And in that notice of intent, well, in the process, it is expected then that data is given to NMED, all data. Do you see a difficulty in really getting all of that data from the companies?
Not if they're going to participate through the notice of intent process. Some of the pilot, I'll be honest with you, some of the pilot projects that are closed loop, meaning none of this treated water is leaving the system. It's all being perhaps separated, analysis gathered, and then this water combined back together to be used to be disposed of via a class 2 UIC well. Those that I've seen done, there are companies that are not releasing that information. They're keeping it proprietary for the time being. Part of the reason for that is some of this is newer technology that's coming on for these pilots. These companies they're looking at it from a competitive standpoint, that they want to make sure that this is exactly what they want it to do. But now obviously, when they get to the point to where they want to move to discharging this water, whether it's land application or surface discharge outside of the oil and gas industry, they will be required to submit that data. So in the case of New Mexico, where we have the NOI process, companies, if they're going to participate in that, will have to release that data to the state.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking because there's some skepticism, I think, among other parties that they would actually do that.
I do believe I heard perhaps some testimony yesterday of some comments regarding that, well, they wouldn't release the data that perhaps was unfavorable to the outcome. I think that's up to the state. The state is going to specify this is the data we want to see. We want to know what these contaminant levels were found in this water. And I don't think whether it's an operator or a service provider, you're going to be allowed to submit the data and go, we've got 5 lines here that are blank. I don't believe that's going to be the case.
Okay. And then going back to the case of Texas, so are they required to give all data in their activities?
Yes, they are. And in retrospect, because that letter of authorization process has been published by the Railroad Commission, so it is available for public review. Should have submitted that as an exhibit, but it specifically spells out, here's the data that we want to see. Here's the frequency that we want to see it during this potential 1-year pilot project. And then, as I mentioned, TCEQ for surface discharge to a waterway, they again have a specific set of criteria on here's all the information we want and here's how often we want to see it. And in addition to that, both instances, I should make sure we point that out, the data that they're requiring, the analytical data, must be through a lab that is certified under the National Environmental Lab Accreditation Program, so a NELAB lab.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Are there other requirements in terms of state or other oversight of, like, are there inspections or anything of facilities?
The Railroad Commission is very interested in seeing these pilot projects. So I know a couple of their individuals that are involved with it, and they have said that they will want to come out and take a look at various times throughout the project. Within the TCEQ discharge permit process, that is a built-in portion of it that at any time you could be subjected to an inspection unannounced.
Okay, so there's the unannounced inspections, but also they're looking to have invitations
Yes.
to look at the
Yes,
sites.
you are
Okay.
correct.
Have you seen companies resisting that in any cases?
Again, Commissioner, that if companies are wanting to move forward with this, that resisting it is not going to be a good way for them to go about it. So the ones that are actively pursuing this are accepting that as that's going to be a part of it.
Okay. And then you were talking about the amount of investment in either of these cases, either in Texas or in New Mexico. Well, I guess you did talk about New Mexico already. Are you seeing companies resisting investing on that LOA process?
No, we're not. Matter of fact, as I mentioned, there are 2 that I'm aware of already. So they've invested into technology that would treat that volume of water. In transparency, there's one that my company is involved with that will likely come to fruition sometime later this fall and move forward. And in addition to that, there was another one we're considering possibly for next year. So no, I think the companies understand that that is the first step that's going to potentially allow for larger projects in the future, for larger land application projects over a larger area. And so you have to go through this process properly, the way it's outlined, to produce the data before you're ever going to be allowed to go to that next step.
Okay. Are you familiar with any cases where companies have not met the requirements?
No, I'm not. I will say anecdotally that is a concern that industry has. I think the phrase has been that there's going to be some wild cowboy out there. And we don't, industry is opposed to that. We don't want to see that happen. We all know that not in this instance, but many others, all it takes is one bad apple to upset the apple cart for everybody else. So we tend to try to monitor and sell ourselves and be sure that there's nobody out there that is trying to go rogue and go outside of the existing regulations. I remember a couple of years ago, I had one individual say that he was tired of waiting on a permit, so he was just going to move forward. This was in Texas. And he asked me what I thought would happen. And I said, well, I think first of all, you're going to get a cease and desist letter from, I'm not sure if it'll be the Railroad Commission or TCEQ. And they're going to tell you, you must cease and desist discharging this water immediately, or you're going to be fined so much a day. When you continue to no longer do that, I said, then the next thing will be probably the county sheriffs, or most likely the Texas Rangers will show up on location and you will go to jail.
Yeah, okay, thank you. No more questions.
welcome.
I
Thank you,
appreciate
Commissioner.
the testimony.
Okay, Commissioner Patton.
No questions.
All right, Vice Chair Armstrong.
Thanks. Just a few questions for me. I appreciate your focus on something that you've noticed the commission has interest in the Texas process, and appreciate you including on your PowerPoint slides the permit numbers for the TCQ permits that you've described today. Did you, I don't think any of those permits or documentation on those permits are included as exhibits though, are they?
No, I do not believe we included those as exhibits. You can go to TCEQ's site and you can download them based on those permit numbers that there, and they will give you, you can download the actual application itself as well as a current status of the process of where it's at within the review process.
Okay, thanks. My question on these is how is TCEQ asking for the when and how is TCEQ asking for characterization of the water?
So my understanding, and to be honest with you, my company is also in the process of preparing initial applications for several different discharge locations. So we're working with an engineering firm that specializes in that. It's a minimum 330-day process for review. And throughout that 330 days, along with several different public comment periods, there are specific timelines in there when you need to have this analytical data to us by this time. You have to have a description of your technology to us by this time. You have to have additional analytical data to us by this time. And it's spelled out within their permitting process.
And is that analytical data before or after treatment?
So both. You have to provide a certain amount of raw data, of raw produced water data ahead of time, but then you also have to demonstrate through like a pilot project what's the quality of water that you're going to be able to provide or discharge to that receiving stream.
And on the front end of that, before treatment, how are we sure that we're identifying all of the potential contaminants in the water?
So they have a process similar to, they're not looking for 400 different contaminants in the water. They're looking for essentially, I believe it's something like 70 different primary contaminants in the water. Then they look for a more extensive list once you get on the process where the water has been desalinated and there are approved analytical techniques for that water.
Okay, what concerns have been raised in Texas about whether that leaves something out?
That I'm not aware of. I have no doubt that there are concerns that have been raised from some groups, but I'm not aware specifically of what those concerns are.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. I think we'll break for lunch now. And Commissioner Dominguez, when we return, we'll have the 1 o'clock public comment session, and then we'll go to your questions. I know you're anxious. Thank you all. 1 o'clock.